Chapter 5 of The Adventures of a Bear and a Great Bear, too. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by T.R. Love. The Adventures of a Bear and a Great Bear, too, by Alfred Elwes. Reverses. Solitary as were Bruin's habits by nature, he had felt, since his residence in a town, a change stealing gradually over him, and the necessity of companionship becoming every day more sensibly experienced. In his late position, he had had the constant companionship of Tom and the learned society of his master, which, indeed, he was but little capable of appreciating, besides the acquaintance of some inferior animals whom he had managed to fall in with during his idle hours, though these must have been of the very lowest class, the reader who is aware of the character of that great beast will readily suppose. Tom was, however, now gone. Poor Schwein, too, had departed, and Bruin's fine clothes and altered condition entirely precluded at present a return to his former associates. Society, he felt, he must have, and upon his choice now depended his future fortunes. It was whilst this necessity was pressing on his brain that one morning, when lolling in all the indolence of ignorance allied to wealth, he was surprised at the appearance of a diminutive spaniel, admitted by his porter, who, dressed in a rich scarlet livery, bore a letter in his belt, which he presented with a certain fawning grace to our hero, and hastily departed. This was the first epistle that worthy had ever held in his own paws, so it may well be judged he was but little prepared to investigate its contents. He turned it over and over, and then put it to his nose, for the scent which it emitted was pleasant to his sense of smell. But still this gave him no hint at its meaning. Never before had he felt the annoyance which a want of education inevitably causes. But now that it did strike him, instead of arousing his energies to cure so serious a defect, a cure, too, which he could, under present circumstances, so easily accomplish, it only moved his anger to think that the little scrap of paper which he held in his paw, and which he could, without the slightest effort, crush into nothingness, withheld its secrets from him, whilst every mincing puppy in the streets could command its every word. Ah, Master Bruin, you are not the first to make the discovery that knowledge is superior to brute force. Angry or not, he wished to know the meaning of the note, and summoned to his presence one who had managed to procure the chief place in his household. Cunning fox as he was, he commanded that worthy to read its contents aloud. Fox obeyed, not at all displeased that he should be selected for this duty, as he foresaw, from the so-called Count's ignorance, that he would be able at a future period to turn his intimate knowledge of his master's secrets to good account. He therefore read as follows: "You may believe I must be actuated by a strong feeling in your favor when I thus forget what is due to my sex and rank, and overcome all the prejudices which canine society builds up as a barrier to intercourse with foreigners. I confess it, the feeling is a strong one, but I rely on your honor to save me from the ill effects my imprudence might otherwise lay me open to. If you are willing to know farther, and are the animal I take you for, you will be in waiting tomorrow evening, after sunset, at the extremity of the mews in the cat's quarter of the city." This missive, written in bold but feminine characters, was without a signature, and when Fox had retired, with a cunning leer upon his sharp features, and Bruin was left alone to meditate upon the singularity of the adventure, that great beast lost himself in conjectures as to the writer, and figured to his imagination a creature very different, no doubt, to the being actually in question. His impatience, however, to get over the interval of time which must elapse ere his curiosity could be gratified, was sensibly felt by every inmate of the mansion. Nothing seemed to go right. The soup was tasteless, the viands were overdone, and the vegetables raw. Never was there so fastidious a bear. The cook more than once contemplated some rash act. The poor little turnspits crept into corners with their tails between their legs, fully expecting to be sacrificed in some moment of wrath, whilst the various house servants, pussies of doubtful reputation, seemed to creep about the place as though they were every moment in dread of being accused of purloining certain savory-made dishes, reserved especially for cook's private friends. Fox, too, the steward and factotum of the establishment, appeared not to possess his usual sleek and quiet ease, but as the evening drew near got restless and fidgety, though he tried to be calm, and even more jocose than usual. He had been absent half the morning, no one knew for what purpose, not that he ever condescended to divulge the causes of his movements, but there was a slyer look in his eyes and a sharper appearance about his clever, pointed nose than ordinarily animated those features. The hour drew nigh. The sun was going down when the Count von Brunn, most superbly dressed, sallied forth from his dwelling. His demeanor was observed and criticized by every domestic in his household, who, crowding to the windows, watched that great bear go forth, as he fancied, to conquer. Fox allowed him to turn the corner, then, enveloped in a cloak which completely hid his figure, he let himself out and glided after his master. Bruin, meanwhile, strutted on till he reached the quarter of the city inhabited by the descendants of the feline race, and as he had never before been in that part of the town, he was at first utterly confounded by the discordant cries. Instead, too, of the order prevailing in the canine portions, the inhabitants seemed to take delight in the wildest gymnastic demonstrations, and certainly seemed to prefer the housetops to any other lounging place. Kittens, in horrible abundance, were frisking about in every direction, and the scene was altogether of a character which seemed to justify the wisdom of the magnates of Caneville in obliging this singular people to dwell in a distinct part of the town, a rule which, with a few exceptions, was strictly carried out. On reaching the Mews, a place so called at the outskirts of the city in this direction, and sufficiently removed from the noisy streets as to make the spot a very solitary one, Bruin perceived he was alone at the rendezvous. So, to while away the time, he strutted to and fro and meditated, in his usual style, on his own self-importance. He was aroused from his reverie by a slight bark or cough, and raising his head, he perceived in the dim light a tall and graceful figure, deeply veiled. He hastily advanced, his rough nature for the first time touched at this proof of confidence, and his vanity suddenly rising to a dangerous height, and taking the delicate white paw which drooped gracefully from a mantle within his own, he unclosed his jaws to make some tender speech. But before he had time to commit himself by his ignorance, the young lady uttered an aristocratic squeak, and darted away with the utmost swiftness, and Bruin, at the same instant, found himself seized by a strong grip from behind. He turned round with a violence which threw his assailant a dozen paces off into a pool of stagnant water, his own coat being slit right up the back by the movement, but he was at once attacked by half a dozen others, who seemed bent on his destruction. Bruin's great strength, however, served him in good stead. With his back against an old wall, he received the assaults of his adversaries with all his wonted ferocity. so that after 10 minutes' fighting, they drew off, leaving 2 of their number motionless on the ground, and a third struggling in vain to escape from the unsavory hole where the whisk of Bruin's coat-tails had cast him. To this spot Bruin now proceeded, and sitting himself down on the edge, told the struggling dog he would help him out if he would divulge the meaning of this unexpected attack on him. The half-drowned cur, having supplicated the bear in vain to let him out before he commenced his narration, in accents sadly interrupted by his throat getting at intervals choked with dirty water, explained that himself and the others of his assailants were the attendants of one of the most noble families in Caneville, and that their master, learning from some member of Count von Bruin's household that he, the Count, intended meeting the eldest daughter at this spot tonight, had commanded a body of his servitors to be in readiness to fall upon him, and if possible take him prisoner for presuming to raise or lower his eyes to a damsel of such standing. Scarcely had Bruin heard this communication to an end, than, despite his promise and the poor dog's cries, he caught up a huge clod of earth and dropped it upon the devoted head of the struggling animal beneath. There was a great splash, and a bubble or two came to the surface of the horrid pool, and the brutal deed was consummated. Yet at the same moment Bruin regretted he had been so precipitate, for he had not learnt which member of his household had played the spy. As he slowly left the place, he revolved this subject in his mind, but could come to no satisfactory conclusion. For though Fox appeared the most likely to be guilty, that worthy animal had made himself so useful to his master that he could not well manage without him. He resolved, nevertheless, to watch him closely, and with this prudent resolve he reached his own door. Very different was his appearance now to that which presented on his issuing from the mansion. His coat torn to ribbons, his hat without a crown, his majestic frill rumpled and bloody, and his waistcoat without a single button left wherewith to restrain the exuberance of his linen. All his domestics were eager in their inquiries and offers of service, and Fox was so overpowering in his expressions of regret that all suspicion vanished from Bruin's brain at once, and he attributed his informant's tale to some malicious calumny invented to save his life and conceal the true cause of the attack upon him. Our hero, finding that the paths of gallantry were filled with so much unpleasantness, resolved, like a prudent animal, to avoid them carefully in the future. But as his desire for an introduction to society continued, he availed himself of the offer of his steward, who promised to procure him introductions to youth of the best families. The class with which Fox managed to bring him into connection was the most worthless in Caneville, consisting of fast young dogs who had a singular knack of reversing the order of nature, and going to bed when other animals were getting up, and thinking of rising when the discreet part of the world deemed it time to retire to rest. They had formed themselves into a sort of club, which they called the Hard and Fast, and indeed no terms could better express the habits of the members, for they gamed hard, drank hard, and talked hard, and lived so uncommonly fast that it was not surprising that, though quite young, they should have many of the infirmities of age. To these worthies Bruin was an acquisition, for he was rich, ignorant, and gullible, whilst they were poor, grasping, and unscrupulous. At the very first interview, all parties were equally delighted with each other. The ease of his new companion's manners was perfectly charming to Bruin, who considered it as a proof of their breeding, and every following day strengthened the connection. Riotous parties of pleasure were constantly projected, for which their friend von Bruin paid. Banquets of the most expensive kind were always spread upon his table, at which his dear fellows of the club assisted themselves, and, indeed, so closely were the bonds of union drawn that after some time many of them could not bear to separate from their esteemed count, and therefore took up their residence with him altogether. If disorder were running such a race in company with the chief of the establishment, it may be conjectured that but little prudence or economy was displayed by the domestics. Extravagance of every kind ran riot amongst them as wildly as with their master, and they scrupled not at all sorts of petty pilfering where there were none to censure or restrain. Fox, it is true, had the right, and possessed the influence requisite to do so, but for some evil design of his own, possibly that his private peccadilloes might escape unnoticed, he seemed tacitly to submit to such a state of things, and in some instances actually encouraged it. And what could be the only result of such a life of dissipation, unchecked by a single effort of discretion? Why, nothing but the most irretrievable ruin, and ruined the bear was after 3 months' trial. And when, following a banquet of several days' duration, the clouded intellects of the beast were made sensible of the fact, when he found his table cleared for the last time both of servants and guests, when he traversed the various apartments of his mansion and observed all stripped, destroyed, and echoing only to the sound of his own footsteps, when, in fine, he discovered that he was again alone in the world, without any portion of that wealth which he had so sadly abused, and with many new and vicious tastes which he had no longer the means to gratify, bitter indeed were his lamentations, shocking his fits of anger. These over, and they lasted long, long days, he seriously examined the state of his affairs. With the exception of the clothes upon his back and a little change in his pocket, he possessed absolutely nothing, so effectually had his kind friends and faithful servants stripped him of his means. It was, therefore, with no enviable feelings he left the house, his house no longer, to seek a shelter for his head and a crust to appease his hunger. He carefully avoided all his former resorts, and directed his steps to those parts of the town where poverty and vice were accustomed to assemble, strong in their numbers and their misery. Among them he now strove to bury his griefs and acquire consolation. But alas, it was at the cost of every hope of virtue which might yet lurk in his nature. Characters like Bruin's, that are ever more apt to imitate the evil than the good which is around them, can only acquire some fresh stain from every contact with the wicked, and thus our bear sunk lower and lower in the scale of beasts, till many even of his new associates at last shrunk from him. Some months after Bruin's being turned out of his splendid home, there was a great fair held just without the town of Caneville, and, as is usual in such cases, the lowest orders of the population assembled there. The Honourable Miss Greyhound, who had been a prey to feelings of a very mixed nature since her interrupted interview with Bruin, had joined a party of fashionables in an unusually long walk, and on their return to the city by a different route, they came upon the fair. They stopped on a rising ground at some little distance to view the sports. Then, observing a group with a tall, ungainly figure in the center, a little to the right, they drew nearer to observe the proceedings. The great beast in the center had his back to them, so they could not observe his features, but they saw that his clothes were ragged, his whole appearance very dirty, and his hat a particularly bad one. A dozen of heavy sticks were at his feet, and a couple were under his arm, whilst at some 20 paces distant, 2 wands, with an ornament or trinket at the top of each, were stuck upright in a straw bag, ready to be thrown at by any adventurous puss or puppy who had a coin at his disposal. A couple of cats were lovingly walking at some distance, another was climbing a large tree which overhung the place, and a fourth was lazily seated high above, whilst in the neighbourhood of the animal who was presiding over the scene were several dogs and a cat or two waiting for their turn. The tall beast now altered his position, and the strongly marked features of a bear became plainly visible to the party. At the same time, he caught sight of the fashionable group, and, with a fierce expression in his eye, surlily invited the well-dressed males to take their chance at 3 throws a penny. A gentle howl from Miss G was the only reply as the party hastily retreated, for she recognized in the dirty, degraded beast who was presiding over this vulgar sport the object she had once looked on with affection, the once wealthy Count von Bruen. End of section 5.